Welcome to the Network Build Grow podcast, the show where business owners, entrepreneurs, and professionals share their stories, lessons learned, and powerful strategies for building relationships and growing their circle of influence. With Melissa Taylor, your host, each week we'll bring you actionable insights to help you build a better network and a better business. Let's dive in.
Welcome back to the Network Build Grow podcast. I am here today with Barry Finkelstein, founding principal of Truth Advisors. So glad you could be here with me today.
Glad to join you, Melissa.
Yeah. So now we met pretty recently, within the last couple of months, I think, maybe 3 or 4 months. Tell us a little bit about Truth Advisors.
Well, Truth Advisors is a consultancy that really focuses on helping mostly mid-sized companies that are going through seismic change. They're looking at a merger and acquisition. They're maybe undergoing a leadership transition, perhaps contemplating entering a new market, maybe undergoing some sort of crisis scenario. Something fundamentally is different about their business, and they're looking for a way to get through to the other side, sometimes looking much more long-term than short-term. And my area of expertise is really in building the strategic roadmap from a communication standpoint that helps companies get from A to B, changes perceptions with their most important audiences, whether it's employees, investors, customers, certainly helping them kind of develop that roadmap from a communications standpoint that gets them to where they want to get to.
Okay, great. How did you get involved in this? How did you get started?
I've been doing it for a long time, mostly on the agency side, working with companies all up and down the East Coast of various sizes and in various industries. But to have the opportunity to really focus my time and attention serving the kind of companies that I want to work with in a wide range of industries, problem solving and working closely with C-suite executives, that was something that I wasn't always able to do in an agency environment, and being a sole practitioner and a consultant has given me those tremendous opportunities.
That's great. So you mentioned that part of what you do is create that roadmap, not only for the internal communication, but the external communication, which
Mhm.
some people would call PR, right?
Yeah,
Like making sure
yeah.
that that message gets out there. So talk to us about that industry, because I think that industry fascinates a lot of people.
It certainly's changed a lot, and I've been doing it for 30 plus years. And back in the day when I was getting started, getting a major placement in the front page of the newspaper was considered a job well done. You'd pat yourself on the back and move on to the next thing. These days, the conversation certainly doesn't end with what we would characterize as traditional media.
Hmm.
Social media and other forms of internet-based media provide, not just a megaphone for traditional coverage, but also a really important place to connect with audiences on a one-to-one basis. So many companies and brands have taken it upon themselves to publish their own content as opposed to going through the gateway and intermediaries of the traditional media folks, TV, radio, newspapers. Not that those aren't necessary or important. I think that third-party credibility that earned media still brings to the equation is an
Hmm.
important part of the discussion. But there are so many other ways to connect with audiences. And I think a lot of companies are taking much more of that to heart, not just with regard to their own channels like websites and their own social platforms, but even the direct interactions with customers, with employees. They're doing it on a much more thoughtful and on a much more strategic basis.
Yeah. In the industry, since I train a lot of speakers and we talk a lot about the difference between owned media, earned media, and paid media.
Mhm.
Are those 3 terms that are still widely used in your industry?
Yeah, there are. And there's a fourth one called shared media, which would be
Hmm.
things like social, where you don't always have direct control over the content. Really, nobody has total control
Hmm.
over the content and the messaging. But if you're not playing in that space, you're leaving it to chance, right? You're leaving it to others to kind of shape the narrative around your organization. So it's called the PESO model, PESO,
Hmm.
paid, earned, shared, and owned. And that's really sort of a hallmark of strategic communications platform is, how do we account for how we show up in all 4 of those channels.
That's wonderful. Love me a good acronym. Helps you remember things. That's great.
That's
So
right.
you've been doing this for a long time, like you said, from an agency side. When did you venture out onto your own?
I've done this twice actually. I started my own agency, about 13 years or so ago in Greenville, South Carolina.
Hmm.
And the goal there was to scale it, to build it into an agency, have people working for me. That's back in the day when we did crazy things like all showing up at an office, 5 days a week. Very, very different time and a very different model, and honestly, a very different stage in my life and my career. So this go around, it's something very different. Back in 2024, I launched Truth Advisors to really be an individual consultancy, not looking to build my enterprise off of the labors of others, but rather giving clients direct access to somebody who has 30 plus years of experience, who's worked in so many different industries and has encountered so many different communication scenarios. I found that there was a lot of value in that offering. And rather than trying to compete with the very many good PR firms that are out there in the Charlotte marketplace and beyond, I decided to do something that really leaned into my skills and my strengths
Mhm.
as a sole practitioner.
That's great. So, with that in mind, let's talk about networking from the standpoint of when you were with an agency
Mhm.
and now when you're a solopreneur. What has changed in the way that you network between those two?
Yeah, first and foremost, when you're in an agency environment, business development is very much a team sport. There's usually one person who has primary responsibility for that that carries the title of business development manager or something similar.
Mhm.
Chief revenue officer is a fairly common title that you'll find in agencies occasionally, but they're relying on the depth and breadth of the team, whether it is to bring different areas of expertise into the mix or different experiences in different industries. You're taking a look at the totality of the team that you have and say, what would be the best group to assemble to go after this new business opportunity?
Mhm.
When you're on your own, as I am currently, it's you look around, you are the team. Like there's no one else really to turn to. The responsibility falls, solely on your shoulders. But that's also in some ways very liberating because you can choose what types of opportunities you want to pursue. You can, develop those personal one-to-one relationships that are so important to networking. You can leverage, not just your contacts, but your reputation and your successes to
Mhm.
create future opportunities for yourself. So I found it very rewarding.
Yeah, let's hone in on that last one that you said, because I think a lot of people when they're networking, and we're not talking about going to an event because that's part of it, but it's a very small part of networking.
Mhm.
But when you are networking, the importance of that reputation that you're bringing to the table every time. Let's
Yeah.
talk about that. And how do you look at the reputation that you want to bring to the table? And how do you make sure that's coming across?
Reputation, I think it's a sum of a lot of individual parts, right? Certainly, experience is an important piece of that. Whether it is citing specific case examples or talking about specific industries that you've worked in, you can talk about experience, but that's really only part of the reputational story. Reputation, part of it is very intangible. It's hard to quantify. It's things like integrity. It's
Hmm.
things like following through. Certainly there's sort of barred equity that comes in the form of references or recommendations from others. That's an important piece of building your reputation. You've got to look at it holistically and figure out how to build sort of a tapestry that tells your story when you are networking, whether it is within a group of folks that you're already familiar with, or especially when you're going out, into a marketplace that might be brand new for you, or
Hmm.
encountering individuals that don't know your backstory.
Hmm.
You got to be able to tell that in a concise fashion, and that's not just leaning on experience, but talking about some of those intangibles as well.
Yeah, character is a big part of reputation for sure.
Hmm. Hmm.
So you joined Network Build Grow. You came to a few events, joined pretty quickly after you started coming, but that was an
Yeah,
environment where you didn't really know anybody.
yeah.
So when how do you put your best foot forward? What would be some advice from you that how does someone put their best foot forward when they're entering an actual event full of
Mhm.
people that they don't really know?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things at play there. Number one is just to be authentic, right? Be yourself and not try to be something that you're not or someone that you're not, because
Mhm.
you're not going to probably put on your best performance if you're constantly thinking about, am I fitting the mold of what I wanted to appear at? Just be yourself. That's what tends to come naturally for most of us, and honestly, it's what tends to attract most people
Mhm.
to us as individuals, is showing up as your authentic self. I think another important piece of it is, having some expectations going into an organizational meeting or even a one-to-one networking situation. What is it that you hope to achieve out of it? But with that comes a measure of flexibility. And I'll be honest with you, and I've shared this with you before, I think, Melissa. When I first entered Network Build Grow, I didn't quite know what to expect about it. I was introduced to the organization by our friend Gary Gagnon.
Hmm.
And it was really my first exposure to a networking organization. And I thought, well, I'm going to go in and I'm going to make some contacts that ultimately will lead to, business development opportunities for me. That hadn't been the case at all. But in fact, I found something even more rewarding, which was a group of like-minded people who are sort of on the same journey as I am. They may
Hmm.
be at different stages in their individual paths than I am, but what a great place for me to learn how to network and how to step out of my role of being a communications advisor, instead wear the hat that is also required of the job as a founder and principal, which is business development, right?
Hmm.
So, from folks who sell Tupperware to people who provide health and wellness services to folks who are on the cutting edge of AI. Like, I've learned so much from folks in terms of how they market themselves. That's been really useful for my journey.
Yeah, I think people forget that side of networking a lot. They go looking for the deal, looking for the client, looking for the next opportunity, and they miss what's standing right in front of them,
Hmm.
which is
Hmm.
somebody who could help them be better at what they're doing.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, and which is incredible. I love that you voiced that on here to let people know, networking is not just about exchanging business cards and getting that next deal. Although that's always nice when
Sure.
that happens. Yeah. And you never know who can introduce you to who. And we've all heard that before. So if you're in a
That's
room
exactly
of,
right.
yeah, if you're in a room of 10 people, each person represents about 200 people that they know. So you just never know. Okay. So can you share a specific example of how networking has really played a part of your journey? That could be when you're at the agency, when you decided to step out of the agency, doing what you're doing now. But how has the networking really played a big part in your journey?
Yeah, my very first assignment in my new consultancy came from networking. It came from reaching out to a former colleague, and just to have a sort of a social check-in, but also to, let them know that I was, now out on my own and doing my own thing. And we went to coffee and had a conversation. And 2 weeks later, she called me up and said, "Hey, I think I've got something I want to bring you in on." So, to your point
Great.
earlier, Melissa, like, you never know what conversations are going to lead to your next opportunity. I went in with very modest expectations. It was something that I sort of instinctively knew that I should do: reach out to those who are most familiar with my work, right? Because
Hmm.
those are the sort of the multiplier effect. Not just the number of people that they know, but the force multiplier of their familiarity with my expertise and how it might align with needs they would see in the marketplace. I just kind
Hmm.
of instinctively knew would put me in the quickest position to benefit from tapping into that network. And sure enough, it paid off with my first assignment.
That's a great example. That is a great example. If you network for your business, you already know follow up is everything when it comes to growing relationships and driving success. But here's the thing, most of us want to follow up well. We just get stuck. Staying consistent, keeping it personal, making it stand out, it's hard. That's why I use Net Effect IO. It makes follow up simple, cuts through all the noise, and helps me stay on top of every relationship without dropping the ball. I never miss a follow up, and honestly, my network wouldn't be the same without it. So check it out, neteffect.io. And right now, you can use promo code NBG50 for 50% off of your first month. Neteffect.io, your secret weapon to unforgettable follow up. So, as people get started in networking, the number one thing that we hear from people all the time is, I don't know what to say. I don't know when they go around the room and they ask you to introduce yourself. I don't know what to say. So, you being a communications expert,
Mhm.
what are some tips that you have for people to know what to say?
You know, I talk to clients all the time about understanding the difference between features and benefits. People always want to talk about the features of the product or service that they offer, and they don't think often enough about the either the problem that it solves or the opportunity that can create for that customer, for the end user.
Hmm.
And so that's probably the number one thing that I would tell people to think about when they're going out and networking, right? Don't just tell people about what you do, but talk about the impact that what you do has on organizations like the folks that you're speaking with, right?
Yeah.
That's the difference between features have been. I don't know that, diddly squat about cars. I don't. I know enough to be dangerous, right? I know what anti-lock brakes are, but I have no idea how they work. But if you tell me that stepping on an anti-lock brake system is going to allow the vehicle to stop twice as fast as without and provide that extra measure of safety, like now I get it. That's a feature, translated into a benefit for a
Yeah.
consumer. So really
Hmm.
think about the benefit that you're providing to your customer, whether it's a consumer or in a business to business situation.
Yeah. I mean, just think about a cereal box, right? Like the
Hmm.
nutrients ingredients are that's on the side in little small print. What's on the front? 12 grams of protein. Okay, I understand that.
That's right. That's right.
Right.
Yep.
Right. I know that I need that. So exactly. Benefit, benefit, benefit. Okay, so let's do some rapid fire networking questions. You ready to go?
Yeah. Let's do it.
Okay. First thing that comes to mind, a common mistake that people make when they network.
I think a common mistake that a lot of folks make is, trying, like you talked about earlier, getting to the sale. Like, how do I, immediately look for opportunities to be able to make a sale? They're busy talking about themselves and not doing what I would characterize as active listening. There's a difference
Mhm,
between hearing and listening.
mhm.
So really being able to take in the information that others are sharing with you, that's more than likely your best opportunity to find a way to suggest how you might be able to help them solve a problem, right? So active listening as opposed to just, shooting from the hip, I think is probably
Yeah.
one of the most common mistakes I see.
Yeah, I think one of the best advice I got early on was I think he called it the power of 3, which was if I am having a conversation with you and you tell me what you do, I have to ask you 3 questions to further clarify it before I can talk about myself.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that I am actively listening, trying to figure out what could I ask him next about it? What could I ask him next? Where am I curious? Where am I curious about what he does? And really get so I liked that power of 3. So that
I
was
love that.
wonderful.
I love having a
Yeah.
goal with that in mind.
Yeah, sometimes it's tough, but at least you can try. All
Hmm.
right.
Hmm.
So speaking of conversations, here's another one.
Hmm.
What is a number one thing that you say besides, so what do you do to start a conversation?
Yeah, I love to get people talking about themselves, and particularly diving into challenges. That's, tends to be where my offering can provide the most support and assistance is to
Mhm,
overcome challenges. So, a simple, what's one of the biggest challenges that you're facing these days? There's so much change going on around us. Nothing is static. So, that sometimes that's a good way to kind of frame it, in consideration of all that's changing around us. What's one of the biggest challenges that you're facing in your business today?
yeah, that's a great way to start a non-surface level conversation.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people, especially after you've met somebody a couple of times, right? You don't need to hear what they do again,
Yeah,
right? You don't need to hear that again, but now
yeah,
you want to take it to that next level.
yeah.
Mhm.
Even for a
Yeah.
newcomer, though, I found a lot of folks on my first interaction with them. They're really well because honestly, they're searching for answers, right? If
Yeah,
you
that's why they're
phrase it
there.
in the form of a challenge, it means that they haven't figured out what the solution is yet. It's still a challenge to them, so they're looking for
Mhm,
any possible resource to be able to arrive at at an answer.
mhm.
So they're usually very receptive to that question, and that opens them up to a dialogue where maybe I can find a way that I can be of support to them.
Yeah, that's great. Or connect them to somebody else that you know if you're not a
Absolutely,
good fit.
which is just as helpful.
Yeah, just as helpful. You're still the hero because you
Hmm.
still connected them. All right. So Barry, tell me when you go to an event and you go back to your office, what is a really good follow-up suggestion that you really try to stick with?
Yeah, I sort of have a three-part formula to follow up. First of all, I try to do it almost immediately within usually the first business day of my encountering somebody and having that conversation. So immediacy would be sort of the first leg of the stool, if you will. The
Mhm,
next piece of it is trying to provide some sort of a follow-on action, right? Either suggesting that we regroup or connecting them with somebody that can help answer the question that they had that I wasn't able to answer, but something that is going to necessitate a response. I want to get a conversation going and not just be one and done. So I try to
mhm.
make sure that there's a follow-on action that's a component of that follow-up. And then the third piece of it is, quite honestly, just doing what I said I was going to do. If I promised them a link to an article that we were discussing, or follow up information about X, Y, or Z, I try to make good on that promise. That's just showing up and presenting myself as a dependable and reliable partner. I think those three components are really important to my method for follow up.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. So that's really good for that initial follow up. What do you do then after that? So they respond, they don't respond, kind of where do you take it from there?
Yeah, I'm still kind of experimenting with what the right pacing is for follow up. You don't want to
Hmm.
be in somebody's inbox every day, but you don't want to leave it go for weeks and weeks at a time and become forgotten. So, I think you've got to kind of zero in on what's the right pace for you, what's the right pace for the urgency of the conversation. You've
Hmm.
got to have some understanding of what's on the other person's plate as well to figure out when do you want to try to, inject some new life into that conversation. But also, as the dialogue continues, look for ways to build more of a rapport with the individual. If
Hmm.
it's someone that I just met, we're going to have sort of a superficial relationship. Whatever we discussed and whatever sort of common ground we found in that initial conversation becomes the basis for our relationship. But over time, I'll try to broaden that relationship, asking questions about their kids. You have any plans coming up for spring break vacation? Like, just trying to get them to know them as individuals. That
Hmm.
provides the basis for more of a deep personal relationship, as opposed to that more superficial initial understanding.
That's great. Well, I have really, really enjoyed this conversation, and I want to thank you again for taking some time out of your busy schedule to be with us today.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Great. And you can find all of his information in the show notes to connect with Barry.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Network Build Grow podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a fellow entrepreneur or professional. And of course, if you're not yet part of our community, visit networkbuildgrow.com to connect with us. Until next time, keep building and keep growing.